The Quiet Tragedy of the Victorian Brothel Worker. Excerpt. Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. Settle in, turn the lights way down low, maybe grab a mug of something warm. We're going to glide gently through another long, quiet night of history, the kind that whispers to you just before you drift off. Tonight, we're setting the dial back to the Victorian age, an era that was famously stiff-collared and absolutely terrified of ankles, but was also, let's be honest, kind of a grimy, damp mess underneath it all. We're not going to be talking about Queen Victoria's mourning habits, or what industrialist invented a new kind of slightly better suit. Nope, we're heading to the shadowy, mostly ignored corners of the cities, to a world that the Victorians officially pretended didn't exist, while simultaneously relying on it to exist very much indeed. We are talking about the life, or maybe the slow, grinding non-life, of the Victorian brothel worker. And let me tell you, it was about as far from a romantic melodrama as you can get. It was mostly just cold, tiring, and terrifyingly brief. The sheer scale of the problem, as the moralists called it, and by problem they meant women not starving in the streets with extra steps, was staggering. This wasn't just a few dark alleyways, oh no. In 1857, a guy named William Acton, who was a respected surgeon, and naturally deeply involved in studying these things because of science, estimated there were over 80,000 women working in prostitution in London alone. That's a small, very sad army. 80,000 people trying to make it to the next day in the shadow of Big Ben. And that's just the low-end estimate. Other people, prone to a bit of Victorian sensationalism, threw out numbers like 200,000. It doesn't really matter which number you choose. The point is, there were so many women that it became an inescapable part of the urban landscape. The first thing to understand is that for the vast majority of these women, this was not a choice made in a moment of reckless abandon or even greed. It was a choice between this and starving to death, or being committed to the workhouse, which frankly was often just a slower form of starvation and social death. Imagine you're a young woman who's managed to get a job as a domestic servant. Sounds decent, right? You're working for a wealthy family, maybe a minor roble or a well-off merchant. Well, you're working 14 to 16 hours a day, sleeping in a damp attic room, eating scraps, and you are entirely at the mercy of the master and mistress. If the master decides he's tired of you, or the mistress decides you looked at her the wrong way, you're out, fired, immediately. No severance, no unemployment benefit, nothing. You are now standing on the cobbled street with a tiny, pathetic bundle of belongings, and you have exactly zero prospects. The factories were often worse, the pay was even lower, and the work was brutal and dangerous. So you look around. Where can a woman with no education and no resources earn a night's rent? The answer, depressingly, was almost always the same. As one of the women interviewed later put it was either the river or the streets. A truly bleak little menu of options. And this is where the hierarchy of the trade comes in, because of course there was a hierarchy. The Victorians organized everything, even their vices. It wasn't just one big miserable pit, it was a miserable staircase. At the very, very top, the equivalent of the historical penthouse suite, you had the kept woman, or the doxy. She was usually the long-term mistress of a very wealthy, often titled gentleman. She didn't work the streets. She had her own small, respectable house, a coach, and a servant or two. Her job was essentially to be beautiful, entertaining, and always available to her one dedicated patron. She could have nice things, wear expensive silks, though of course, the second the patron got bored or died, her comfortable little world evaporated into the London fog. It was a temporary, very fragile luxury, not a career path. Next, you had the workers in the high-class brothels, the bagnios or nunnery houses. These places were usually found in the nicer areas, like St. John's Wood or Mayfair. They were impeccably furnished, smelling faintly of expensive perfume and not so expensive disinfectant. The women here were often quite young, carefully selected for their looks, and kept in a kind of velvet-lined cage. They wore beautiful clothes, ate decent food, and their clients were aristocrats, members of parliament, and super-rich industrialists. The prices were astronomical, and the madams, the women who ran these houses, were often formidable businesswomen who had clawed their way up from the bottom. But let's be clear, even in the nice places, the women were deeply controlled. They were often in debt to the madam for their expensive clothes, their room and board, and even the tiny fee for a doctor. This was a classic debt trap. You couldn't leave until the debt was paid off, but the debt kept growing faster than you could pay it off. They were, in a very real sense, prisoners in silk gowns.
The middle ground and the pit. The middle ground, as we were saying, is where the statistics really started to stack up. This wasn't the silk-lined luxury of Mayfair. This was the shilling-a-go type of place, the kind you'd find crammed into the side streets of Westminster or Clerkenwell. They were often run out of pubs, music halls, or slightly too respectable lodging houses. These were the brothels of the lower middle-class client, the clerks, the shopkeepers, the aspiring young men who had maybe 20 shillings to their name and wanted to feel like a big shot for 10 minutes. The environment in these places was far more utilitarian. The rooms were small, usually only furnished with a thin bed, a basin, and maybe a chair, and the sheets were changed, shall we say, optimistically. The pace of work here was relentless. The women didn't have the luxury of waiting around for a single wealthy client to arrive. They had to take call after call, night after night, often working shifts that ran from late afternoon until the gas lamps were dimming in the early morning. And the cost structure here was simple, brutal, and designed to keep the women running just to stand still. For every shilling the client paid, the worker might only see a few pennies. The rest went straight to the madam or the landlord, covering the rent of the room, the basic food provided, and the general use of the establishment. The woman was essentially a very high-taxed subcontractor. Let's not forget the emotional cost here, which was astronomical. The high-class places tried to enforce a veneer of politeness, maybe even a theatrical flirtatiousness. In the middle-ground houses, that facade often crumbled. The women were exhausted, ill-fed, and constantly worried about disease, pregnancy, and debt. They relied on alcohol, or more tragically, the newly popular easily acquired laudanum, an opium tincture, just to dull the pain and the sheer grinding monotony of the job. It was a self-medicating spiral that often led directly to the very bottom of the staircase. And the bottom. Oh, the bottom. Let's drift down to the damp, cold, truly hopeless end of the spectrum, the streetwalker and the occupants of the lowest houses. This was not a business, it was a daily struggle for survival. These women were often the ones who had failed to secure or maintain a place in a brothel, or who were too old, too visibly ill, or too desperate to be admitted to the slightly better establishments. The average age was devastatingly low. Many started in their mid-teens, and by their late 20s they were often considered aged in the context of the trade. The streetwalker, the woman standing under the cold, flickering gaslight near the docks or the military barracks, had the hardest lot of all. She had no protection, no warm room to retreat to, and was entirely at the mercy of the weather, the police, and of course her clients. She risked constant harassment, theft, and violence, and had no recourse at all. To report a crime would be to invite attention from the police and possible arrest under the vagrancy laws. Her prices were predictably pitiful. A penny, maybe two, for the quick, furtive transactions conducted in alleyways, doorways, or, if she was lucky, a very cheap shared lodging house. The money she earned immediately went to secure a bed for the night, a coffin bed in a doss house where you paid for 6 hours of shared, cramped space. If she failed to earn the few pennies needed for the bed, she slept on the street, risking illness and frostbite, which only made it harder to earn money the next day. It was a vicious, unbreakable circle. And then we have the lowest houses, often found near the industrial centers or the slum districts like Whitechapel. These were not even really brothels in the organized sense. They were dilapidated tenement rooms, maybe just a single room with a partition, where women who were often destitute, alcoholic, and suffering from multiple ailments worked for almost nothing. The sheer despair and physical degradation in these places were overwhelming. The Victorian reformers and social workers, bless their hearts, occasionally ventured into these areas and recorded the conditions, often with a mix of genuine pity and judgmental horror. They wrote of women surviving on stale bread and gin, sleeping on straw, and having every personal belonging pawned just to survive. Let's briefly touch upon the legal framework, because, of course, the stiff-collared Victorians had to make rules about everything, even the things they hated. And the rules, as you might expect, were entirely aimed at controlling the women, not the system that created them. Enter the infamous Contagious Diseases Acts, or CD Acts. These were introduced in the 1960s, ostensibly to protect the health of the military and the Navy, because, of course, the health of the soldiers was paramount, and the women were merely vectors of disease. These acts essentially created a geographically defined legal zone, usually around naval ports and army bases. Within these zones, any woman who was merely suspected of being a sex worker could be detained by the police, dragged before a magistrate, and forcibly subjected to a mandatory, non-consensual medical examination for venereal diseases. She didn't have to have been caught doing anything. Suspicion was enough. If she was found to be infected, she was then locked away in a lock hospital, which was basically a low-security prison disguised as a medical facility, until she was cured. Now think about this for a minute. The man, the client, the source of the infection, he faced zero penalty, zero forced examination, and zero detention. He was a gentleman, of course. The women, however, faced public humiliation, physical violation, and loss of liberty, all based on a policeman's subjective opinion. Because why not double down on the irony? The acts were an absolute disaster, and they were, of course, fiercely protested, primarily by women's rights activists like Josephine Butler. Butler pointed out very correctly that these laws amounted to the state sanctioning the violation of one class of woman, the poor, for the convenience of another class of men, the men who used them. It took years and years of relentless, weary campaigning, but the CD Acts were finally repealed in 1886. But that's 20 years of state-sponsored abuse that just quietly slipped into the history books. The larger point here is that for the Victorian woman working in this trade, the system, legal, social, and economic, was a perfectly constructed prison with no key. Once you were in, the outside world, the world of respectable marriage, family, and honest work, was sealed off forever. The social stigma was absolute, a brand that no amount of money or repentance could erase.
The madam and the money. Let's float over now to the women who ran the show, or at least the women who managed the day-to-day operations. We're talking about the madams. These were not just middle managers. They were often powerful figures in their local economies, running businesses that generated serious amounts of cash, all while operating in a space that was technically illegal and universally judged. Talk about a complex business model. A madam's path to power was rarely straightforward. Many of them had started exactly where the women working for them were now, in the lowest houses, on the streets, or maybe as a domestic servant who got lucky, or more accurately, got smart. They learned the angles, they understood the clientele, and most importantly, they understood the economics of desperation. To run a high-class brothel, a madam needed to be many things: a sharp accountant, a diplomat, a stylish host, and a very good judge of character. Her success depended on maintaining a delicate balance. First, she needed to keep the law just far enough away. This often meant regular, quiet payments to the local police constable or inspector. This wasn't necessarily a formal bribe. It was often presented as a gift or a fee to ensure the establishment was protected from vagrants and other common disturbances. Of course, the real disturbance being managed was the law itself. Second, she had to maintain a level of reputation and exclusivity. Her clients, the wealthy gentlemen, didn't want to bump into their neighbors or their colleagues. The house had to offer discretion and a certain luxurious privacy. The madam managed the book, the list of gentlemen, their preferences, and their spending habits with the secrecy of a Swiss banker. And third, and perhaps most cruelly, she managed the women. Her power over them was nearly absolute, held in place by that beautifully simple economic tool we talked about, debt. When a young woman arrived, the madam would often provide her with a complete outfit, the expensive gown, the shoes, the cosmetics, all necessary to look the part. She would also cover the cost of her room and food. All of this was tallied up into a starting debt. The woman's earnings were then used to pay off this debt, but the interest, the rent, and the cost of every broken vase or lost glove were added faster than she could ever realistically pay it down. It was a self-perpetuating system designed to ensure loyalty, or at least indentured servitude. The madam wasn't being kind by providing a beautiful dress. She was investing in an asset she intended to keep for a very long time. And the economics of the whole system were genuinely mind-boggling, a stark contrast to the poverty that created it. Let's look at the sheer volume. In the mid-Victorian era, London was a city of nearly 3 million people, and a vast, wealthy empire was funneling money into its center. There was a huge population of single men, soldiers, sailors, merchants, wealthy bachelors, and men who had left their families in the countryside or the colonies. This created a massive, steady demand. The money flowed up. It started with the shivering streetwalker who made a penny, and it ended up with the madam who made a small fortune, and the property owner, often a respectable, church-going pillar of society who owned the building and collected an exorbitant rent. For the men who owned the property, this was a fantastic low-effort investment. They rented their houses to the madams, knowing exactly what they were going to be used for, but maintaining a very useful air of plausible deniability. They never stepped foot inside, they just collected the staggering rental fees. And they were never, ever arrested under the Contagious Diseases Acts, because of course they weren't. So you have this vast subterranean economy underpinning the entire facade of Victorian morality. The rich gentlemen needed the service, the respectable landowners needed the rent money, the police needed the bribe money, and the women, sadly, needed the fleeting chance to avoid homelessness and the workhouse. It was a dark, complex ecosystem that everyone benefited from, except the people at the very bottom, who paid the price with their health and their lives. Let's gently transition now to the one thing that hung over every single worker, regardless of her status or her price, the constant, terrifying threat to her health. In a time before antibiotics, before reliable sanitation, and certainly before any form of regulated health care for the poor, a woman's body was her only asset, and it was constantly at risk of catastrophic failure. The most common and dreaded fear was venereal disease, specifically syphilis and gonorrhea. Syphilis, particularly, was a creeping, devastating horror. It wasn't just a rash, it was a slow, multi-stage degradation of the entire body, leading to neurological damage, blindness, madness, and eventually death. And the Victorian cures were often as bad as the disease. They relied heavily on mercury, a highly toxic substance which was rubbed into the skin or taken internally. This could temporarily alleviate the symptoms, but it also caused terrible side effects: tooth loss, tremors, neurological problems, and eventually mercury poisoning. It was a miserable trade-off. Beyond the specific diseases, the general toll on the body was immense. Lack of sleep, poor nutrition, constant exposure to the elements for the streetwalkers, the overuse of alcohol or laudanum to cope with the mental strain, all of it compounded into a life expectancy that was tragically short.
Many women never made it past 30, dying from things we would now consider easily treatable: tuberculosis, pneumonia, and sepsis from minor injuries. And let's not forget the constant, terrifying fear of pregnancy. Contraception in the Victorian era was unreliable, expensive, and often viewed as immoral. Abortions, if sought, were illegal, incredibly dangerous, and often resulted in the death of the woman herself. If a child was born, the woman faced an impossible choice. She could not raise a child while working in the trade, so the children were often given up to institutions, given to struggling relatives, or tragically succumbed to infant mortality, which was shockingly high among the very poor. The cycle of poverty and tragedy just kept spinning.
Culture, community, and the faint hope of escape. Let's drift quietly into the culture that existed within these shadow communities. Because while the life was brutally isolating, these women didn't live in a complete vacuum. They formed their own internal networks, their own strange little society governed by necessity, shared trauma, and a grim sense of humor. In the lodging houses and the lower-class brothels, there was often a fierce, if fragile, sense of community. The women who worked together understood the pressures, the risks, and the sheer desperation better than anyone on the outside ever could. They often looked out for each other, sharing small amounts of food, lending a few pennies for the night's lodging, or helping nurse a sickness. This wasn't altruism in the classical sense. It was a pragmatic, necessary survival mechanism. If one woman fell ill or was violently attacked, the others knew they might be next, so a basic level of mutual aid was essential. They developed their own slang, their own ways of talking about the clients, the police, and the general misery of the trade, a kind of linguistic shorthand that reinforced their shared identity. The language was often coarse, direct, and darkly funny, a coping mechanism against the endless hypocrisy of the respectable world that judged them. The relationship between the women and the madam was, as we've noted, a key dynamic. But sometimes, in the slightly better-run houses, the madam could act as a bizarre sort of protector. She might enforce a few house rules designed to prevent violence or theft, and she often shielded the women from the worst elements of the street. This didn't make the situation good, but it did make it predictable, which was a form of temporary safety that was highly valued. The occasional bright spot in this dark existence was the music hall. Music halls were the great, boisterous, democratizing institutions of Victorian evening entertainment. While technically respectable, they were where all classes mixed, and they were a vital part of the social infrastructure for the women in the trade. They were places to see and be seen, to find clients in the public setting, and perhaps most importantly, to escape the crushing reality of the back rooms for a few hours. The songs were loud, the atmosphere was thick with smoke and gin, and for a short time you could be part of a crowd, laughing at a silly comedian rather than being alone on a freezing corner. This brief access to pleasure, the cheap gin, the laudanum we mentioned, or the camaraderie of the halls, these were the small, temporary reliefs that allowed the women to simply keep going. Now, let's look at the concept of rescue, the Victorian term for rehabilitation, because the respectable world, having created the conditions for this misery, occasionally felt the need to alleviate its own conscience by trying to save the women they had condemned. This effort was primarily driven by evangelical Christian reformers. They established Magdalene houses or penitentiaries. These were supposed to be safe havens, offering women an escape from the trade, religious instruction, and training in a new skill, usually domestic service. The idea was noble, perhaps, but the reality was often deeply flawed and brutally rigid. First, the entry requirements were strict. The women had to demonstrate a profound sense of repentance and an absolute willingness to submit to the institution's rules. They were often stripped of their personal clothing, given a dull uniform, and made to adopt a new, respectable name.
Second, the life inside these houses was not easy. It involved long hours of laundry, needlework, and highly restrictive rules. Silence was often enforced. The emphasis was less on healing and practical education and more on spiritual cleansing and moral conversion. The women were treated not as victims of poverty, but as moral failures who needed to be broken down and rebuilt according to the rigid Victorian ideal. Third, and perhaps the main reason these houses struggled, was the fundamental economic problem. What did the women do when they left? The idea was that they would become domestic servants, but the stigma of their past, even after a year or two of supposed reformation, was almost impossible to shake. If a respectable mistress found out that a new maid had come from a Magdalen house, she was often instantly dismissed. No reference, no job, and back on the street with nowhere to go. So, for many, the rescue was just another temporary restrictive prison, and the door back to the streets was the only door that remained open. The rate of recidivism, the women returning to the trade, was frustratingly high for the reformers, but completely understandable given the economic realities. The streets, at least, offered immediate cash for immediate needs, something the penitentiaries, despite their moral intentions, simply could not compete with. The fate of a Victorian brothel worker was usually one of three things: early death, the most common, illness, addiction, violence, or the cumulative toll of extreme poverty led to death, often in a poor's house or a pauper's grave. The workhouse. A woman who was too old, too ill, or simply too broken to work was often forced into the final option for the destitute. The workhouse was a grim, soul-crushing institution where families were separated and life was defined by grueling labor and thin gruel. It was the absolute last stop before the grave, and a fate often feared more than death itself. A quiet disappearance. A very few managed to escape the system. Perhaps a client fell truly in love and married her, a truly rare fairy tale. Or perhaps she saved enough money to establish a tiny legitimate business, like a laundress or a small shop owner far away from her past. But these were the exceptions that proved the rule. The vast majority simply faded out, swallowed by the London fog and the indifference of a society that preferred to forget they ever existed. The story of the Victorian brothel worker is, in the end, a quiet tragedy of systemic failure. It's a historical echo of poverty being leveraged for profit, of moral condemnation being applied only to the powerless, and of human lives being treated as entirely expendable commodities in the grand, hypocritical engine of the British Empire.
The sad, sickly, and spoiled. An intro to royal children. Let's take a long, slow breath, then leave the cold, damp shadows of Whitechapel behind us. We are going to float up, way up, past the crowded tenements and the gaslit streets, and land very softly inside the gilded cages of royalty. Because if the lives of the poor were a story of absolute misery, the lives of the royal elite were a study in extreme, highly organized, and often medically terrifying weirdness. Tonight, we'll start a quiet exploration of what it was like to be a royal child in the 19th and early 20th centuries, focusing specifically on the children of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. You might think that being a child in a palace meant a life of perfect comfort and happiness, and you would be wrong, so very wrong. It was a life of emotional starvation, bizarrely strict routines, and a constant smothering pressure to be politically and dynastically useful. The tyranny of the routine. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort, was a brilliant man, a genuinely committed reformer, and a control freak of truly magnificent proportions.
Once he got his hands on the education and upbringing of his 9 children, he essentially turned the nursery into a miniature German military academy nestled inside a palace. The goal was simple: to create perfect, disciplined constitutional monarchs and consorts for the rest of Europe. The result, unfortunately, was a collection of deeply anxious, often rebellious, and sometimes tragically sickly young adults. The routine was ironclad. Everything was scheduled down to the minute: lessons, walks, meals, and most bizarrely, emotional interactions. There was very little room for spontaneity, fun, or the normal rough and tumble of childhood. Victoria herself, let's be honest, was not exactly the most naturally maternal person in the world. She openly admitted to disliking babies. She famously called them ugly and frog-like. Her relationship with her eldest son, Albert Edward, or Bertie, the future Edward VII, was famously toxic from day one. Poor Bertie was born to be king, and he was an absolute disaster in his parents' eyes. He was outgoing, loved dressing up, hated books, and loved being silly. Albert and Victoria saw this as a profound moral failing. They subjected him to endless, grueling studies and lectures, and constantly compared him unfavorably to his brilliant, compliant older sister, Victoria, the Princess Royal, or Vicky. Imagine being a little boy, knowing that your every natural inclination to laugh, to play, to avoid another history lesson was being logged by your parents as a defect that threatened the stability of the entire British Empire. It's a lot to put on a small, uniformed shoulder. This parental rejection created a pattern of lifelong insecurity and a desperate search for pleasure and escape, which defined Bertie's entire adult life. The medical oddities and genetic missteps. Beyond the emotional cruelty, let's talk about the health of this dynastic group, because this is where the weirdness really sets in. The medical care they received was, of course, the best money could buy in the Victorian era, which meant it was often profoundly useless or actively harmful. When they were sick, they were treated with the usual array of bizarre Victorian remedies, laxatives, leeches, or being confined to a stuffy room. But the most famous and devastating contribution the Queen made to the royal gene pool was a quiet little genetic disorder called hemophilia. Hemophilia is a sex-linked recessive disorder where the blood doesn't clot properly. A minor bump that would give you a bruise could be life-threatening. The Queen herself was a carrier, and the gene tragically appeared in her children and then was exported to the royal families of Russia, Spain, and Germany through the usual diligent royal intermarriage. The most famous recipient of the gene was her grandson, Zaritsev Alexei of Russia, the only son of her granddaughter, Alex, Tsarina Alexandra. Watching your young child bleed internally from a simple fall, knowing there is nothing modern medicine can do, must have been a unique kind of regal terror. The desperate need for a cure for Alexei is, of course, the primary reason the incredibly strange man Rasputin gained such terrifying influence over the Russian imperial family. But that's a whole other sleepy monologue. The point is, even with all the wealth, all the power, and all the pomp, a single microscopic flaw in the royal DNA could travel across Europe and bring down dynasties. It's an ironic contrast that the women we discussed earlier were dying of common diseases of poverty, while these princes were threatened by a bizarre inherited blood curse. The princesses, exported for dynasty. The 6 daughters of Victoria and Albert were not much luckier than their brothers. Their primary purpose was simple: to be impeccably trained, politically suitable, and married off to various German princes, grand dukes, and kings to cement British influence across the continent. They were essentially diplomatic cargo, destined to leave home, often forever, and manage a new, unfamiliar court. The one rule that applied to all these children was simple but devastating. You must never, ever cause a scandal. Your personal feelings, your romantic desires, your actual happiness, none of it mattered as much as the quiet maintenance of the dynastic line. We will gently explore the highly dysfunctional marriages of these unfortunate children, but for now, just picture the small princesses meticulously taught to play the piano, speak 3 languages, and sit perfectly straight, knowing their entire worth lay in their future ability to produce healthy, politically compliant grandchildren for Queen Victoria. It was a life of perfect, gilded anxiety, every breath taken for the sake of the empire.
The dissolute heir. Let's zero in on poor Bertie, the Prince of Wales, who was perpetually trying to live up to the impossible standards set by his earnest, workaholic, and deeply judgmental parents, Victoria and Albert. Bertie, as we said, was simply not wired for the intense intellectual regimen his father designed. He preferred people to books, horses to philosophy, and women to state papers. These natural inclinations were viewed by Prince Albert with a crushing level of disappointment. Albert was obsessed with the idea of a morally pure, impeccably disciplined heir, and Bertie was, to put it mildly, the opposite. He was sociable, pleasure-loving, and had a tendency toward laziness. Every report card, every social gaffe, every hint of youthful indiscretion was met with a flurry of deeply critical, often agonizing letters from his parents. Imagine being the heir to the greatest throne in the world, yet constantly feeling like a failure in your own living room. Victoria's attitude toward him was harsh and enduring. She saw his frivolous nature as a threat to the monarchy itself. She famously wrote that she could never forget the sorrow and anxiety he caused them. Ouch! The defining scandal. The great tragedy of Bertie's life and the spark that lit his path of lifelong hedonism came in 1861. Bertie, then a young man training with the military in Ireland, was visited by a famous courtesan named Nellie Clifton. Now, this was a relatively minor indiscretion in the context of the day. Many young men of his class did the same thing. But for Prince Albert, who was already under immense stress and struggling with chronic health issues, this was the ultimate betrayal of the moral standards he had so carefully crafted for the boy. When Albert found out, he was devastated. He traveled to Cambridge to confront Bertie, taking a long, cold, rainy walk with his son to deliver a devastating dressing down about his moral failures. It was a miserable encounter. A few weeks later, Prince Albert became severely ill, contracting what was probably typhoid fever, though the Victorians, with their flair for drama, often attributed any fatal illness to a moral shock. When Albert died shortly thereafter, Victoria immediately and permanently blamed Bertie. She went into a state of intense, decades-long mourning, and the shadow of that final miserable confrontation was cast over Bertie's entire life. Victoria essentially treated him as the source of her sorrow, keeping him sidelined from any meaningful political work for the next 40 years. The marriage, a dynastic necessity. With the death of his father and the moral outrage of his mother, the pressure to secure a respectable, compliant wife for Bertie became overwhelming. The choice fell on Princess Alexandra of Denmark, Alex. Alexandra was universally adored, beautiful, graceful, charming, and conveniently, her family was politically unthreatening to Great Britain, which was a huge plus for Victoria. They were married in 1863. On the surface, it was a magnificent dynastic success.
In reality, it was a union built on political necessity and emotional distance. Alexandra was loving and devoted, but she was also quite deaf, a condition that grew worse over time, causing her to retreat further and further into her own private, quiet world. She was also profoundly intimidated by the demanding and often rude Queen Victoria. Bertie, sidelined and bored, saw his wife more as a beautiful fixture and a mother to his 6 children than as an intimate partner. He was starved for affection and attention, and since his official job was essentially to wait for his mother to die, he had decades of unstructured time on his hands. The result? The Prince of Wales became the undisputed king of European society and the most famous high-class adulterer of the 19th century. The mistresses and the social scene. Bertie embraced a life of relentless pleasure. He was the center of the Marlborough House set, a famously flamboyant social circle that spent its time gambling, traveling, eating 10-course meals, and engaging in light adultery. His string of official mistresses became an accepted, almost institutional part of royal life, something that only the British could manage to make simultaneously scandalous and utterly respectable. His mistresses were always married women of the aristocracy. This was a rule, ensuring discretion and maintaining the facade of propriety. His most famous mistresses included Lily Langtry, the actress known as the Jersey Lily, and the beautiful Alice Keppel, who was so integrated into his life that she was present at his bedside, an arrangement organized by the perfectly polite and entirely resigned Queen Alexandra herself. The irony here is profound. The man who was constantly attacked by his parents for his moral deficiencies ended up defining the glamorous, slightly naughty, but fundamentally stable image of the Edwardian era. He was a disastrous Prince of Wales, but he turned out to be a surprisingly effective king, precisely because he loved people, loved socializing, and understood how to charm a crowd, the exact qualities his serious father and moralistic mother despised. He finally ascended the throne in 1901, after being the Prince of Wales for a record-breaking 59 years. His reign, the Edwardian era, was a brief, sparkling, decadent explosion of wealth and pleasure before the entire world plunged into the madness of 1914. It was the moment the old, stiff Victorian morality finally breathed a sigh of relief and had a stiff drink, thanks entirely to the formerly rebellious little boy named Bertie. But even Bertie's pleasures were underpinned by a deep, constant anxiety about his mother's disapproval and his own perceived failures. The gold plating was thick, but the emotional damage was permanent.
The performance and the price. The dance of deception. Mr. Hawthorne, seated by the fire, was a formidable figure, a man in his late 50s with a substantial silver waistcoat and a meticulously maintained mustache. He was the embodiment of the respectable New York merchant politician, solid, prosperous, and burdened by an inner restlessness that Bellwether's expertly curated setting was designed to soothe. When Elara entered the small receiving room, the quiet room used for initial, sensitive meetings, Hawthorne barely glanced up from the evening paper he held, though she knew he was intensely aware of her presence. This feigned indifference was part of the ritual. The man must feel in control, the proprietor of the situation, even when he was about to surrender a hefty sum for a prearranged intimacy. Bellwether performed the introduction with the slick, practiced ease of a society hostess presenting a promising debutante. "Councilman, may I present Miss Eleanor? She has just been remarking to me on the curious complexities of our nation's expansionist policies. A mind as finely tuned as her beauty, I assure you." Hawthorne finally lowered his paper. His eyes, the color of weak tea, traveled over Elara's dress, resting briefly on the modest high neckline before snapping back to her face. "Miss Eleanor,"
he said, his voice a low rumble. "A pleasure. I find few in this city willing to discuss matters of state with any true intellectual rigor. Too much passion, too little sense." Ilara offered the smile she had practiced hundreds of times, a blend of deference, interest, and faint amusement. "Councilman, I find that matters of state, much like matters of the heart, are best managed when viewed through the lens of history, not mere excitement. Do sit down." She moved to the liquor cabinet, pouring the claret herself with a steady hand. The ritual demanded she serve him. It placed her instantly in the subservient role, even as her conversation lifted her to the level of a conversational equal. "The Philippines," she began, handing him the glass, her voice low and intelligent. "A rather messy business for President McKinley, wouldn't you agree? I confess the arguments of the Anti-Imperialist League, particularly those regarding the economic drain versus the supposed moral uplift, are rather compelling." Hawthorne's eyes lit up, not with scholarly fervor, but with the gratification of having his expected intellectual stage set perfectly. He launched into a lengthy, detailed justification of manifest destiny, the white man's burden, and the strategic importance of Manila Bay. Ilara listened with intense focus. Her job was not to debate, but to prompt, not to win, but to validate his perspective. She sprinkled in precise questions about the congressional appropriations and Senator Lodge's foreign policy stance. Every nod, every tilt of her head, every soft interjection of "remarkably well put, Councilman," was a form of payment, a balm to his ego. This was the true skill of the parlor girl in an elite house, the ability to make a powerful man feel both intellectually stimulated and morally superior, allowing him to justify the transaction about to occur. He wasn't paying for crude sex, he was paying for a salon experience that culminated in the inevitable. He was paying for the lie. The conversation lasted precisely 27 minutes. Bellwether stood by the door throughout, her presence a silent, formidable clock. When Hawthorne paused, taking a satisfied gulp of wine and beaming at Ilara, Bellwether stepped forward. "I believe, Councilman," the madam said smoothly, her eyes catching the light, "that Ilara has quite settled your thoughts for the evening. If you would care to move on to the private chambers, I shall have your arrangements finalized." Hawthorne rose, his posture shifting subtly. The politician vanished, and the patron emerged. He took Ilara's hand. The skin of his palm was thick and damp, a jarring contrast to the smooth, cool velvet of her glove. "Lead the way, Miss Eleanor," he murmured, his voice now lower, losing its oratorical edge. The subtle shift from political discourse to proprietary command was a chilling moment Ilara experienced a dozen times a week. The mask was slipping, and the real transaction was about to begin. A moment on the stairs. As Ilara led Hawthorne toward the grand, curving staircase, they passed the main parlor, where several other girls were arranged like beautiful, weary dolls, awaiting their cues. In a quiet corner, near a massive potted fern, sat Leela. Leela was a stark contrast to Ilara's refined elegance, a striking woman of 25 with fierce red hair and eyes that had seen too much New York grit. She wore a gown of aggressive, impractical turquoise that suited her defiant nature. She came from the poorer, rougher houses downtown, having clawed her way up to Bellwether's by sheer force of personality and business acumen. She had no illusions about the men they served. She saw them purely as walking wallets. As Ilara passed, Leela's sharp blue eyes met hers. It was a brief, wordless exchange. Leela's eyes said, "Another one of the talking ones? Don't let him waste your time." Ilara's eyes replied, "I know. I need the money." This shared moment of weary reality was vital. It was the unspoken solidarity among the working girls, a constant, necessary acknowledgement that beneath the lace and the sophistication, they were all in the same highly volatile business, relying on each other for small, vital checks on their sanity.
The stairwell was lined with heavy tapestry and illuminated by a large stained glass window depicting a scene of classical, virtuous womanhood. Ilara despised the hypocrisy of that window, knowing that every ascent was a descent into the moral cellar of the city, framed by the very ideals she was transgressing. On the third floor, she stopped at room 7, a chamber decorated in ironically delicate French Rococo style, all powder blue silk and cherubs painted on the ceiling. It was designed to make the illicit feel light and romantic. Hawthorne stepped inside, shedding his coat and his conversational pretense instantly. The cold mask of the politician was replaced by the demanding entitlement of the customer. "The room is warm," he noted, loosening his necktie. "Get comfortable, Eleanor. We have an hour." Bellwether's fee for a premium girl and the use of the Rococo chamber for 60 minutes was $20. Of that, Ilara knew she would see perhaps 4 if she was lucky and incurred no fines for being late, for breaking a rule, for having a stain on her fan. $4 could buy a week's worth of medicine for her sister, Sarah. This was the math that ruled her life. The tyranny of the clock. The critical transition occurred the moment the door closed. The intellectual Miss Eleanor disappeared, and the transactional Ilara remained. She had to manage the next steps without instruction, reading the councilman's shifting mood and specific expectations. "Do you play cards, Eleanor?" Hawthorne asked abruptly, pointing to a small inlaid table. "I am quite proficient at whist, sir," Ilara responded automatically. "No, I mean faro, the game of chance, the cards of life." He chuckled, a rough, wet sound that grated on her nerves. He wasn't interested in a game. He was testing her compliance, looking for the limits of her willingness to entertain his fantasies. Ilara knew the subtext, the demand for dominance. "I am prepared to play any game you wish, Councilman. I am entirely at your service this hour." Her submissive response relaxed him instantly. His tension eased, confirming that the real need of most men in this house was not simply physical release, but the restoration of their masculine authority, an authority often challenged in their homes or their businesses. Here, they were undisputed kings. He moved toward her, his movements no longer the confident stride of a councilman, but something heavier, more needy. The performance was over. The price was due.
The calculated distance, coping mechanisms, the mind's retreat. For Ilara, the act of physical intimacy was less a surrender and more an exercise in dissociation, a term she would not have known, but perfectly understood in practice. Her body remained in the Rococo room with Councilman Hawthorne, but her mind retreated to a perfectly constructed interior space, a cool, quiet library she had built from her memories. While Hawthorne spoke, demanded, or performed, Ilara focused on the specific, tangible details of her retreat. The smell. She conjured the scent of lavender and old parchment from the library where her father used to read to her, pushing back the cloying perfume of Hawthorne's pomade and the stale cigar smoke clinging to his coat. The sound. She mentally recited passages from Shelley or Byron, the rhythmic meter acting as an anchor, muffling the unpleasant sounds of the room. The focus. She fixated on small, neutral details, the way the dust motes danced in the shaft of light, the precise number of painted cherubs on the ceiling, anything to prevent her eyes from meeting his for too long, anything to stop her from truly seeing the transaction. Hawthorne, like many of the more powerful patrons, treated the encounter as a rite, a reward for his strenuous public life. His conversation was an extension of his earlier political monologue, now laced with self-pity and thinly veiled complaints about his puritanical wife. Ilara's role was to be the non-judgmental confidant, the perfect listener who would validate his masculinity and forgive his transgressions. "My wife, she talks of charity and temperance," she grumbled, his voice heavy with resentment. "But she offers no comfort, none.
You, Eleanor, you understand what a man needs." Ilara offered a soft, murmured agreement. A man who carries the weight of the city on his shoulders deserves a moment of peace, councilman. This was the core lie, that the men were victims of their own moral society, and the women they paid were their saviors. Ilara and every successful girl in the Tenderloin had to become a master manipulator of this complex emotional theater. The faster she validated his narrative, the sooner the hour would end. The business of health and fear. When the hour was finally over, Bellwether never allowed a minute extra unless a premium was paid. Hawthorne dressed, his demeanor shifting back to the serious, measured politician. He dropped a $20 gold piece onto the marble mantelpiece, a small, arrogant gesture of largesse, before descending the stairs without a backward glance. Ilara had to immediately perform the post-encounter duties. She retrieved the money, meticulously straightened the blue silk bedding, and checked for any stray belongings. The room had to be immaculate for the next client, a cycle that might repeat 3 or 4 times before the evening was over. Her immediate focus, however, was on the most terrifying reality of the trade: disease. The fear of contracting a venereal disease, specifically syphilis, which was understood to be incurable and brutally degenerative, was a continuous visceral horror. Bellwether's doctor was unreliable, and the protective measures were primitive, often involving little more than strong soap and prayer. Ilara rushed to the washing basin, using a caustic, rough soap provided by the house. She knew the cleansing was more for her mind's peace than true protection, but it was a necessary ritual of control in a life devoid of it. As she finished, the door opened. It was Leela, the red-haired woman from the parlor, carrying a small tin cup of steaming broth. "Bellwether's sending up a new man, a journalist, looks like a snake. Drink this, it's got a drop of laudanum in it, just enough to settle the tremors." The sharing of small illicit comforts was another vital form of solidarity. Laudanum, an opium and alcohol tincture, was officially banned, but Madame Bellwether often provided a weak version to help the girls calm their nerves. It was a dangerous, addictive palliative, but on a night like this, with the weight of Hawthorne still heavy on her, the offer was a lifeline. "Thank you, Leela," she whispered, sipping the bitter, sweet liquid. "How was your afternoon?" Leela shrugged, leaning against the doorframe. "Mine was Captain Fitzwilliam. He likes me to read him the stock market reports and pretend to be his secretary. I earned $5 extra for correcting his ledger work. Sometimes they just want a cheap employee who can also—" She trailed off, the implicit meaning hanging heavy between them. This exchange highlighted the economic ingenuity of the girls. They learned to monetize every aspect of themselves, their hands, their minds, their ability to listen, to increase their meager percentage. The line between brothel worker, companion, and part-time secretary was often blurred. The shadow of reform. A loud, aggressive knock on the main door downstairs jolted both women. It wasn't the discreet rap of a patron. It sounded like authority. Leela moved instantly to the peephole embedded in the mahogany. "It's a Comstock agent," she hissed, referring to the Vice Crusaders inspired by Anthony Comstock, the zealous head of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. The Comstock movement viewed prostitution as the root of all urban evil. Their raids were less about saving the women and more about seizing obscene materials and prosecuting the madams and patrons. Bellwether's house, being high-end, usually bought protection from the local precinct's depot. A weekly envelope of cash ensured they were tipped off to raids. Tonight, the system had failed. "Quickly, Eleanor," Leela ordered. "The hidden compartment in the wardrobe. Shove everything." Ilara sprang into action. She swept the gold piece and a few silver coins from the mantelpiece, stuffing them into a tiny velvet-lined niche hidden behind a loose panel in the wardrobe. This was survival, keeping the madams from seizing your wages in the chaos. Bellwether's voice, sharp and commanding, echoed up the stairwell. "All girls to the parlor. We are ladies of the evening conducting a social gathering. No one speaks of money. Eleanor, get downstairs and play the piano." The immediate transformation from fear to professionalism was instantaneous. This was the final critical skill of the Victorian brothel worker. The ability to become a perfectly poised, impeccably mannered gentlewoman at a moment's notice, maintaining the facade that the house was merely a gathering place for sophisticated society. Ilara's hands, still trembling slightly from the laudanum and the rush, had to find the composure to play a flawless Schubert sonata. Her life and the precarious balance of the entire establishment depended on the conviction of her performance.